I was standing in the kitchen of my parents' house, where everything seemed the same as in my childhood years. The same heavy oak furniture, the same embroidered tablecloth, the same faint smell of vanilla and lemon from my mother's cupcakes neatly laid out on a sloping display case. Only the feeling inside me was completely different, uncomfortable, prickly, as if the walls of this house suddenly began to press down, forcing me to shrink into a dense lump of discontent and bitterness. "She deserves it more, honey," Mom said, not even looking up from the stack of exquisite cupcakes she was arranging in front of her, arranging them with the same meticulousness with which she had been putting Jessica's and my lives on the shelves for years. I stared at her, trying to make sense of what she'd said, trying to find something in her voice other than an unbiased certainty that she was right. "Jessica has always been more devoted to her studies," she continued, holding a still, warm cupcake in her hands and smiling faintly. "You've always had other interests." The casual dismissal hurt more than if she had just slapped me in the face. I expected anything: evasive explanations, awkward excuses, but not this icy indifference with which all my efforts were thwarted. I looked at the wall, where my medical school diploma still hung in a wooden frame, as if confirming that I really existed, that I really deserved what I had. But even this symbol of achievement suddenly seemed empty, as if it were just a decoration in a house where my presence was always something secondary. "Mom," I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, even though my hands were shaking slightly. "We both graduated with honors. We had exactly the same average score." Mom finally turned to me. Her gaze was the same as it always was when I asked uncomfortable questions, a little disappointed, as if I was doing something wrong again. "Your sister doesn't have a rich mentor like Dr. Flemington who is interested in her future," she said in a flat voice. "You've always had advantages, but Jessica didn't." I almost laughed at the absurdity of that statement. Dr. Vivian Fleming was my supervisor, not because she was interested in my future, but because I earned this position by filling out laboratory journals at night, working 80 hours a week while Jessica was skiing in Aspen with her parents. "The advantage was that I worked myself to exhaustion," I said, not hiding my bitterness. "While my twin sister received unwavering emotional and financial support from you." Is that what I'm being punished for? For finding the opportunity for mentoring yourself? I kept the tremor out of my voice, but Mom didn't look impressed. She looked at me as if I was complicating the obvious again, and didn't say anything. At that moment, my father entered the room. He put his hand on his mother's shoulder, as if confirming her words, and sighed wearily. "No one is punishing you, Roxy," he said, as if it were a simple, obvious fact. "We're just being practical. Your sister needs more help than you do. You've always been more resourceful." Resourceful. That's the word they used when they explained why they never came to my student research presentations, but flew across the country for Jessica's volleyball tournaments. Resourceful. That word justified why Jessica got a new car for her 21st birthday and I got a gift card at the gas station. There was a debt relief party tomorrow, her parents' idea, of course. A large family, friends, even several of our former professors are all invited to celebrate her achievement, as it was written in the invitations, although this achievement consisted only in the fact that her parents paid for her education, relieving her of the financial burden that I had to cope with myself. I swallowed and, without looking at my parents, said, "I have to go. There's an early shift at the hospital tomorrow." Mom looked at me, and this time there was something like concern in her voice. "But not about me. Are you coming to Jessica's party anyway?" Of course, the only worry was not to ruin my sister's evening. I nodded. "I'll be there." The thought made my stomach clench, though. When I went outside and went to the car, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I automatically took it out and saw a message from Dr. Fleming. "I need to talk to you urgently about the Patterson Scholarship." Big news. I stared at the screen, and a cold realization hit me. My parents' favoritism wasn't just unfair. He was going to be publicly humiliating. and there was nothing I could do to stop what was coming. I sat in Dr. Fleming's office, feeling the words she had just spoken slowly seep into my mind, replacing everything else. Worry about the upcoming party, annoyance with my parents, even the long-standing, deep-rooted fear that my efforts would never be truly recognized. My voice faltered as I tried to grasp the full significance of those two simple words. "You, Roxy," Dr. Fleming repeated warmly, leaning forward a little, locking her fingers on the table. "Johns Hopkins University is offering you a research position on a Patterson Scholarship. You deserve it, and I want you to know that this is not just recognition of your work. It is proof that your intelligence, your perseverance, and your ability to see more than others make you an exceptional specialist." I nodded, even though the words stuck in my throat, and for a second I allowed myself to imagine what would happen next. Moving to Baltimore, working at one of the most respected neurosurgical centers in the world, the opportunity not just to follow a dream, but to shape it, make it a reality. But then my parents' faces came back to me, their unfailing restraint when it came to me, and their boundless pride in Jessica. I could imagine how they would take this news, not as a triumph, but as another reason to accuse me of taking something that could belong to my sister. "Roxy?" Dr. Fleming's voice brought me back to reality. I shook my head, shaking off my thoughts, and finally managed a smile. "Thank you, Dr. Fleming. I do not know what to say." She laughed, leaning back in her chair. "Then just say yes." "Yes," I breathed. When I left her office, the air seemed cooler than usual, even though it was a hot day. I felt a strange interweaving of joy and anxiety, pride and some kind of premonition inside, as if this news, the greatest in my life, would not be received the way I had hoped. And, of course, I had to put it into practice this evening. My parents' house was full of people when I drove up to it in the late afternoon. I immediately noticed how carefully everything was prepared: tables covered with white tablecloths, garlands of golden light bulbs strung between the trees in the courtyard, a huge banner with the inscription, "Congratulations, Jessica," hanging above the main entrance. The smells of expensive wine, mint, and fresh bread were in the air. Mom, as always, wanted everything to be perfect. My father was standing on the porch, talking to one of the guests, and when he saw me, he raised his eyebrows slightly, but did not move. I took a deep breath, adjusted the strap of my dress, and entered the house. Jessica was standing in the center of the living room, laughing at something one of our aunts had just said, her blonde hair neatly coiffed, and a new chain, which I'm sure her parents gave her, glittered around her neck. She was holding a glass of champagne in her hands, and when her gaze met mine, I saw something in it that I couldn't immediately recognize. "Roxy." She took a step toward me, smiling, and for a second it seemed to me that there was more to this greeting than just politeness. "I already thought you weren't coming." "Of course I did," I replied, forcing a smile. "Oh, honey, you look tired," Mom's voice came from behind, and I felt her palm lightly touch my shoulder before she turned to one of the guests. "She's at work all the time. The poor thing doesn't take care of herself at all." I ignored this comment and took a glass of wine from the tray of the waiter, who had apparently been hired specifically for this evening. The atmosphere was warm and lively, and there was a kind of solemn excitement in the air, and I couldn't help feeling that this was just another play in which I was playing only a minor role. "Well," Mom turned to me, giving me that light, almost casual smile again. "Didn't you hear that your sister was invited to an interview at one of the best private hospitals? This is a huge opportunity." I felt something constrict in my chest. "That's great," I replied, though my fingers tightened around the glass. "Yes, it's just incredible." Jessica chimed in, but she seemed to notice something in my expression. "Roxy, are you okay?" I looked at her and suddenly realized that this evening was not the time for news about my scholarship. Everything I say will turn into another reason for discussion, another argument in favor of the fact that I supposedly always get more than my sister. "Yeah, I'm just tired," I said, forcing a smile. Jessica nodded, but I could see the understanding in her eyes. Maybe for the first time in years, she really saw how I felt. But before she could say anything else, Mom clapped her hands, attracting the attention of the guests. "Friends, let's raise a glass to our Jessica. She has worked hard to achieve this, and we are more proud of her than we can express in words." The guests applauded, cheers rang out in the air, and I raised my glass and took a sip of wine, which suddenly seemed too tart to me. I understood that no one here cared about my achievement. And at that moment, I made a decision. I won't tell them about Baltimore. Not today. I immediately realized that Jessica was nervous. Her smile was wide, but her eyes darted, and her fingers lightly tapped the stem of the glass. Despite the veneer, she looked tired, and I realized that for her this evening was not as triumphant as her parents had imagined it to be. "I'm glad to see you, too," I said, returning her smile, but there was still a note of caution in my voice. "Well, what does it feel like to be the center of attention?" She rolled her eyes, but gave a restrained smile. "Honestly, strange. Everyone talks to me like I won the Nobel Prize, and I just got, what? Debt-free years of work? I appreciate that my parents paid for everything, but they act like it's something incredible." I nodded silently, taking in her words. This was probably the first time that Jessica openly admitted that she felt uncomfortable because of her parents' favoritism. I always assumed that she just took their support for granted, not thinking about the fact that I was getting a lot less. "It's probably like a prom," she added with a light sigh, sipping her champagne. "Only then I don't remember them renting an entire restaurant." I looked at the huge banner with her name on it, the golden lights playing on the sparkling glasses of the guests, the waiters scurrying between the tables with perfectly arranged snacks, and suddenly I was acutely aware of the contrast. In all my years of study, my achievements were marked only by brief congratulations, and my own parties consisted of random toasts in noisy bars with friends, because my parents never had the time or desire to organize something like this for me. I looked at my sister again. "Have you even told them that you don't like it?" She snorted. "Really? You know Mom and Dad. If I had objected, they would have just said that I was being ungrateful." I wanted to say something else, but at that moment, Mom clapped her hands loudly, attracting the attention of the guests. "Dear friends and family," she began in her perfectly modulated voice. "Today we are gathered here to celebrate an important stage in the life of our dear daughter Jessica. We always knew that she would succeed, that she would be a brilliant, caring, incredible doctor, and we are proud to be able to support her along the way." She paused, giving the guests time for approving nods and brief applause. "We would like to raise our glasses to her diligence, perseverance, and outstanding achievements. Jessica, dear, we love you." The audience burst into applause again, and I noticed that Jessica shrank slightly under the gaze of dozens of people. "My God," she muttered to me in a low voice, pretending to keep smiling, "this is too much." I squeezed her hand, but before I could say anything, Dr. Fleming appeared in the center of the room. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed, her navy blue dress fitted flawlessly, and there was that confidence in her eyes that always made me admire and fear at the same time. She stepped forward, ignoring the guests, who began to whisper, not knowing who she was. "If you'll excuse me," she said in a flat, clear voice, and the room immediately became quieter. "My name is Dr. Vivian Fleming, and I am here not only as a professor at the University of Michigan, but also as someone who is proud of one of his most outstanding students." I froze, anticipating the inevitable. "I would like to say a few words about Roxy Collins." The guests turned to me. I felt my stomach tighten, but Dr. Fleming continued, ignoring my sudden numbness. "Roxy is a person who not only studies, but paves new paths in medicine. The Patterson Scholarship Committee at Johns Hopkins University selected her from hundreds of applicants across the country. This is an incredible achievement." A whisper swept through the hall, and I noticed how my mother nervously straightened up, and my father frowned. This is the most prestigious research program for young neurosurgeons, Dr. Fleming continued. Her work in the field of neurovascular regeneration has been recognized as groundbreaking. And most importantly, thanks to her achievements, she receives full loan forgiveness, generous scholarships, and the opportunity to work with the best specialists in the world. I heard one of our relatives gasp. Someone started clapping, but quickly stopped when he noticed the tense faces of my parents. I looked at Jessica, expecting to see annoyance, but there was only a mixture of amazement and relief in her eyes. Dr. Fleming turned to me. "Congratulations, Dr. Collins." For a second, silence reigned in the room, broken only by the clink of glasses and the muffled noise of the night city outside the windows. Then someone applauded again, more confidently this time, and soon others joined in. I looked at my parents, waiting for their reaction. Mom froze, her lips pursed slightly, but in her eyes I saw not admiration, but confusion. My father looked more restrained, but his expression was almost the same as it was when he told me that Jessica had fewer opportunities than me. But I didn't care. I straightened up and finally allowed myself to smile. "Thank you, Dr. Fleming," I said, picking up a glass of champagne from the table. "It is a great honor." I looked at my sister. She still looked stunned, but when our eyes met, she suddenly grinned and, raising her glass, nodded briefly at me. "For Roxy," she said softly, but loud enough for me to hear. At that moment, I realized that maybe I had been wrong about Jessica all these years. Perhaps she also felt like a prisoner of this family system. Perhaps this evening was the beginning of something new. I stood there, looking at my parents, at Jessica, at Dr. Fleming, feeling the tension build, as if the air around us had become thick, heavy, saturated with unspoken thoughts and hidden intentions. They were doing it again. They were again trying to turn the situation in Jessica's favor, again presenting her achievements as if they were equal or even superior to mine, again rewriting the reality in which I always remained in the background. Dr. Fleming, without losing her casual bearing, looked from my mother to my father, then to Jessica, and I noticed how the corners of her lips twitched in a barely perceptible smile as she took a step forward, breaking the awkward silence. "It's really amazing," she said in a flat, almost affectionate voice, but I knew that tone. I knew that there was steel behind it, because as far as I know, Jessica's application to the Detroit Medical Center does not include any research in the field of surgery. But maybe I just haven't seen her work in this area. I looked at Jessica, expecting to see embarrassment, annoyance, but to my surprise, she looked more tired than angry. Her fingers tightened around the glass, and then, meeting my gaze for a moment, she looked away. Mom opened her mouth, but it seemed like she didn't immediately find something to say. "Jessica is very versatile," she finally said, her voice sounding too sweet, as it always did when she was trying to hide her annoyance. "Of course, she focuses more on psychiatry, but in the end, it's all medicine, and our girls are both wonderful specialists." I pressed my lips together, but said nothing. "Oh, absolutely," Dr. Fleming nodded, letting the phrase hang in the air. "But let's get back to the reason I'm here." I felt my heart beat faster. "Tonight is definitely dedicated to Jessica," she continued, "but as it turns out, this is a significant day for both of the Collins sisters." I saw my mother's back tense, and my father, although he tried to remain calm, clenched his jaw. "I am pleased to announce that Roxy has been selected to participate in the Patterson Fellowship Program at Johns Hopkins University, the most prestigious neurosurgery research program in the country." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone, perhaps one of my former professors, nodded approvingly, and someone looked at each other in surprise. "This program offers incredible opportunities," Dr. Fleming continued, ignoring the tension that was now literally in the air. "In addition to working with leading specialists, Roxy will receive full loan forgiveness and a generous scholarship, which will allow her to focus exclusively on research and practice. This is a tremendous achievement, and I am sure that everyone here is aware of how important this is." There was silence. I looked at my parents. Mom stood there with a frozen smile, as if she didn't know what to do with her face. His father looked gloomy, his hand gripping the champagne glass a little tighter than it needed to be. Jessica just stared at me, and I couldn't make out her expression, whether it was surprise, relief, or something else that eluded me. "Roxy," Mom finally said, and I heard that familiar note of strained politeness in her voice that she used when she didn't want to admit something, but knew she had to. "This. Of course, it's impressive." I squeezed the glass in my fingers. "Thanks," I replied. The father cleared his throat, as if about to say something, but at that moment one of the guests raised his glass. "To Dr. Collins." The crowd became animated. Someone repeated this toast, and soon there was applause, but I couldn't help but notice that my parents were applauding slower than the others, more restrained, with some strange expression on their faces, as if they had just realized that their carefully constructed picture of the world had cracked. When the noise had subsided a bit, Jessica took a step towards me. "Can we talk?" "What is it?" she asked softly. I nodded, and we went out onto a small terrace off to the side of the main hall. The night was cool, and the air smelled of jasmine and candle smoke. Jessica was silent for a long time, then sighed. "You know," she finally began, looking off into the distance, "I've never envied you." I raised my eyebrows in surprise, but didn't say anything. "I knew you were smarter, more persistent. I've always known." She chuckled, but there was no humor in her voice. And I knew that my parents would continue to pretend that this was not the case. "I'm used to." I stared at her, not knowing what to say. But today, for the first time, I realized how unfair it was. She turned to me, and there was something in her eyes that I had never seen before, something like an apology. "You deserve it, Roxy. And I'm proud of you." I swallowed, feeling something slowly falling inside. "Thanks, Jess." We stood in silence while the sounds of the party reached us. Somewhere inside, Mom was probably trying to hide her annoyance behind polite smiles, and Dad was probably thinking about how to explain this news in a way that wouldn't disrupt their version of reality. But I didn't care anymore. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. I saw the expression on my parents' faces change in an instant. A minute ago, they were beaming, basking in pride for Jessica, but now their smiles froze, turning into masks that hid surprise, confusion, and annoyance. My father tightened his grip on the champagne glass, and my mother looked at me as if she had really seen me for the first time. There was silence in the hall, broken only by the whispers of several guests who clearly had not expected such an announcement. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, and my cheeks were flushed with heat. I've never craved recognition, I've never aspired to solemn statements, but something inside of me still demanded justice, not only in front of my parents, but also in front of this whole room full of people who used to consider me number two in the history of the Collins family. "Roxy," her father finally spoke, smiling tightly, "this is certainly impressive." "Impressive?" Jessica repeated, her voice full of indignation. "Father, this is fucking unbelievable. Roxy got one of the most prestigious scientific positions in the country, and you didn't even ask how she achieved it." Mom turned sharply to her, giving her daughter a look, but Jessica did not look away. "Jessica, dear, it's your night," her mother said softly but firmly, taking her hand as if to remind her of something important. "That's exactly why I need to say this." Jessica pulled her hand free, stepping closer to me. "Because if I don't say anything, I'll be complicit in this lie that we all support here. Lying about who really put all their efforts into their career." The guests at the tables began to whisper to each other, some furtively watching their parents, waiting for their reaction. I noticed how Dr. Lee, one of the admissions committee members at Detroit Medical Center, looked at me carefully, and then at my sister, studying the situation as if comparing information. Jessica, Let's discuss this later, in a more appropriate setting, my father suggested, his voice calm, but I could hear the tension in it. Why? Jessica raised her eyebrows. So that you can figure out how to mitigate this? Turn it into something less meaningful? How do you always do? Mom exhaled slowly, her fingers still clutching the glass of champagne so tightly that I was afraid, just a little more, and the glass would crack. I looked at my sister, who was standing next to me, protecting me, perhaps for the first time in my life. Jessica, I said carefully, you don't have to. No, Roxy, we need to, she interrupted me. I've let this happen for too long. I could see emotions fighting inside her, anger, disappointment, and maybe even guilt, for all these years when she was silent. The father tried to take control of the situation again, changing tactics. Listen, we are proud of both our daughters. It's just that today we wanted to celebrate Jessica's achievement. And for some reason, Roxy's achievement can always be celebrated another time, right? Dr. Fleming spoke up, her tone as calm as before, but I could hear a steely note in it. Another time that never comes. The hum of voices in the room grew louder until Mom tapped her glass with her fork, demanding silence. I think that's enough, she said, her voice soft but steely. Let's just get back to dinner. Of course, Mrs. Collins, Dr. Fleming smiled. I just wanted to make sure that everyone understands what an incredible success the Patterson Scholarship has become. This is a rare achievement that requires exceptional abilities. Yes, Jessica nodded. And I think it deserves a toast. She picked up a glass of champagne and, without waiting for her parents' reaction, loudly announced. Let's raise a glass to Roxy, for her brilliant career, for doing it without any help. I saw some of the guests enthusiastically raise their glasses, as the faculty and even several of our distant relatives began to applaud. Mom and Dad just sat there with frozen expressions. I raised my glass, my fingers trembling slightly, but I smiled at my sister. Thanks, Jess. She nodded. I took a sip of champagne, and at that moment something inside me changed. I didn't expect their recognition anymore. I knew my worth. There was a lively buzz in the hall again, muffled whispers, admiring glances directed at me, at someone who had hardly been noticed before, who had not placed high hopes on, who was written off, confident that Jessica was the only one worthy of their admiration. I felt an avalanche of emotions crashing down on me, delight, pride, a slight dizziness from the sudden change in position, and perhaps even a strange feeling of guilt that I had to go through so many years of invisibility in order to instantly become who I always was, but whom no one wanted to see. Dr. Lee looked at me curiously, holding a glass filled with dark gold champagne, her dark eyes sparkling with intelligence and calculation, and I realized that her proposal was not just a formality. Jessica's right, she said, bowing her head slightly, a talent like yours can't be framed. I've seen experts like you, Roxy. People who are changing the very structure of medicine, creating new opportunities where others see only limitations. We should discuss the options, especially if your research can be applied in our clinical practice. I felt my throat go dry. A few hours ago, I couldn't even dream of such a thing. The Patterson Scholarship had already seemed like the highest peak to me, and now I was being offered the opportunity to choose which way to go further, to influence my future, and not just follow the route once laid out. That's incredibly flattering, Dr. Lee, I finally said, struggling to find the words because my mind was racing, weighing the options. And I am grateful for your attention to my work. But you're right, the most important thing for me is research freedom, and the Patterson program gives me a unique chance to develop what I've already started. Dr. Lee nodded, her gaze became a little warmer, something like respect flashed in it. I understand, she said. But you know, good specialists are always welcome, and the doors of the Detroit Medical Center will remain open for you. I couldn't help but smile. It means a lot to me. Well, Dr. Lee raised her glass and took a small sip. Then we will keep an eye on your achievements." She nodded once more and walked away, leaving me alone with Jessica. My sister sighed and put her glass on the nearest table, clasping her hands in a lock. "You know, I'm really proud of you," she said, studying me, and I noticed that there was not a drop of pretense in her voice, not a shadow of envy, which I so often assumed. "Thank you, Jess." I looked at her carefully, as if rediscovering the person I'd known all my life. We both looked back at our parents. They were sitting at the main table, not joining us, not congratulating us, not sharing the moment that was to become the most significant in my life. Mom was saying something to Dad. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, and his fingers were tapping on the stem of the glass in a nervous rhythm. They didn't know what to do. Their script collapsed. "Do you think they'll ever admit it?" I asked quietly, knowing that Jessica would understand what I was talking about. She looked at her parents, then looked at me and shrugged her shoulders. "Maybe someday," she said. "But probably not." I nodded. It didn't matter. Now that I was standing here, feeling truly free, when people I respected recognized my work, when my sister finally looked at me without a shadow of rivalry, I realized that I no longer needed their recognition. I already knew who I was. I looked at the watch box, feeling a strange mix of emotions rising inside me: fatigue, bitterness, and perhaps a drop of dark amusement. They came to me with a gift that was supposed to be a symbol of equality, an attempt to smooth out a discrepancy that had dragged on for years, but their intention looked as strained as the smiles on their faces. Mom sat across from him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, while Dad remained standing, as if he was preparing to leave as soon as he fulfilled his part of this new family strategy. "That's very generous," I said, not opening the box, not hurrying to pick up the watch. "We wanted to show that we were proud of you, Roxy." Mom leaned forward slightly. Her voice was soft, but there was that familiar note in it that I'd heard for years, an attempt to convince me that reality wasn't the way I saw it, that their actions were always fair, even if they felt otherwise. "Really?" I looked up at her, feeling my patience running out. "Then why does it look like you're just trying to even the score?" My father frowned. "Roxy, this isn't fair," he began, but I held up my hand to stop him. "Unfair?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Dad, are you serious? You've both been putting Jessica on a pedestal for years, dismissing all my successes, cutting me out of the family narrative, and now that the world has seen me for who I am, you suddenly remember that you have 2 daughters." Mom exhaled sharply, her fingers clenched for a moment, and then relaxed again. "We've always supported you in different ways," she repeated, like a spell, as if saying it enough times would make it true. "You supported Jessica," I said calmly, without hysteria, without accusations, just stating the fact. "You tolerated me." Mom frowned, but didn't say anything. His father slowly ran his hand over his chin, as if weighing whether to continue this conversation or just leave. "I don't want this watch." I pushed the box back in his direction. "If you thought you could buy my forgiveness, you shouldn't." "Roxy." My mother's voice faltered, and there was genuine resentment in it, but I knew she wasn't offended at herself, but at me for not playing by their rules. "You can keep them." I stood up, emphasizing that the conversation was over. "Or give them to someone who still believes in fairy tales about equality in our family." Dad clenched his jaw, Mom paled, but they didn't argue. They knew I was right. When they left, I sat in silence, looking at the box that remained on the table. I could have thrown it away. She could have left it untouched in some far drawer. But in the end, I just opened the lid, took out the watch, put it on my wrist and watched the pink gold shimmer in the soft light. They meant nothing to me. And that was probably why they belonged to me now. 3 weeks later, I stood in an empty apartment surrounded by packed boxes ready to be shipped to Baltimore, realizing that this moment was not just a physical move, but a final break with the past that had defined me for so long. It was the first step into a life where I no longer tried to earn the love of my parents, did not prove my worth to them, did not wait for their recognition. Jessica was sitting on the windowsill, lazily swinging her leg, watching me seal the last box of books, and there was something new in her gaze, not just sadness from the impending separation, but understanding, which had not been between us before. "I still can't believe you're leaving next week," she said, crossing her arms over her chest. "Detroit won't be the same without you." "You'll be too busy with your residency to notice," I chuckled, but I knew there was some truth in those words. We were inseparable in medical school. We went through everything together: sleepless nights before exams, grueling rotations, moments of doubt and victories. But now our paths were diverging, and for the first time in many years I felt that this was how it should be. Jessica ran her finger along the windowsill, as if considering what to say, then suddenly looked up at me. "I keep thinking about Mom and Dad," she said softly. "About what they did. Or they didn't." I froze, knowing that this conversation was inevitable. "I think all these years I thought I was just lucky because they were paying more attention to me," she continued, "but now I'm starting to realize that they were actually holding me back. They made me dependent on their approval, created this one around me, artificial support, so that I was afraid to do something without them." She shook her head, as if surprised by her own words. "And you? You did everything by yourself." I sat down next to her, feeling a warm feeling rise in my chest, something like pride for my sister, for finally seeing what I had been trying to understand for so long. "You didn't do anything wrong, Jess," I said softly. She shook her head, pursing her lips. "I didn't do it right enough. I should have spoken earlier." She sighed, resting her forehead on her knees. "They're devastated, you know," she said after a pause. "Mom keeps crying about how much you must hate them. Dad tells everyone who's willing to listen about his brilliant daughter at Johns Hopkins University, as if he personally funded your research." I grinned, though there was no anger or bitterness in that laugh, just fatigue and a quiet realization of how little it bothered me anymore. "Let them talk," I said, shrugging my shoulders. "Their approval doesn't define me anymore." And it was true. I spent so many years desperately trying to earn their recognition, sacrificing sleep, privacy, and peace of mind for success, which they never considered equal to Jessica's success, because it was mine, not theirs. But now this need has dissolved, leaving behind only freedom, the freedom to be yourself, to move forward along the chosen path, no longer looking around for their approval. "Dr. Fleming showed me what real support looks like," I said, looking out the window, where the sky was slowly darkening behind the glass. "It's not just a pat on the shoulder or empty words. It's faith in you, even when you doubt yourself. It's challenging you when you can do more, protecting you when you need protection, and seeing your potential without reservation." Jessica nodded, silently considering my words. "So what now? What is it?" she finally asked, smiling faintly. "With us?" I looked at her and took her hand in mine. "We will find our own way forward, without the competition that they have created between us." She squeezed my hand. "I would really like that." She smiled wider, a real smile, the kind I hadn't seen in a long time. "Dr. Roxy Collins, a Patterson Fellow," she drawled with mock solemnity. "I'm so proud of you, sis." I smiled back, feeling as if something inside me was finally coming into harmony, as if all the pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place. The way forward was difficult, but clear. And for the first time in my life, he was just mine.